name's Pip and welcome to my YouTube channels, Mysteries with Pip or Pippa. And today I'm going to be talking about my first case that I've been researching, the Moors murderers. I'm from the same part of Manchester that the Moors murderers are from. So anyone in Manchester, anyone specifically in the north of Manchester will be very aware of this case. We're constantly kept up to date with it. So I didn't really need to do much research, but I really want to raise awareness for this because one of the victims' bodies has still not been found, and by raising awareness, potentially, maybe his body can still be found. This is a case that's always fascinated me. It's actually quite, not only were we born, they did their killings in Gorton in Manchester and I was born there, but my partner, his grandmother, was actually in the same prison as Myra Hindley at one stage, and she was given a Bible by Myra Hindley. It's not really something to brag about, or just I'm constantly aware of this case in my life. And without further ado, this is the Moor murder. This case is very, very distressing. So before I begin talking about the murderers, it's always important to look at the background. Now, Ian Brady, he was raised in Glasgow and he also had a very hard life. He was said to have been very poor with his adoptive mother, and he had no father figure in his life, and he was described as feeling very empty while living up in Glasgow. When he was 14, he was described as having something to the effect of a mental breakdown. He was riding on his bike and he said it felt like he was having a stroke or an epileptic fit, or basically something didn't feel right inside his head. He got off his bike to kind of calm himself down, and he said he had these wicked hallucinations of a face that would show itself, and he thought it was the face of death. He was also described by neighbours as torturing and even murdering cats. This didn't actually deter him anyway by seeing these hallucinations, and many psychologists do believe that this was the first stage of something called paranoid schizophrenia. In males, paranoid schizophrenia is usually seen and also diagnosed in the late teens to early 20s. Therefore, by him experiencing this and his mid-teens, the psychologists reckon this was the start of his paranoid schizophrenia. In 1954, he was convicted for petty thief, and he was so much of a criminal by the age of 15 or 16 that he was actually sent away by a judge to leave Glasgow, to get away. They didn't want him staying in Glasgow anymore with his adopted mother, and so he was sent to live with his biological mother in Manchester. As opposed to Myra Hindley, she didn't actually have a bad childhood. Myra Hindley had a relatively normal childhood for living in working class Manchester at the time. So she wasn't lavished with gifts or kind of luxuries, but she did have a very loving family, and she was especially close to her grandmother. Now, while she did live with her grandmother, she didn't experience any kind of abandonment issues with her parents as Ian Brady did, because her parents only lived a couple of doors down. They were on the same street. She could see them anytime she wanted to, and she was also very close and very protective of her sister. She was seen as a very bubbly woman and also used to babysit for a younger boy. Now, once while growing up, this younger boy said to Myra Hindley that he wanted to go swimming nearby. She said she didn't want to. She was going to hang around with some other friends. This boy went swimming on his own and actually drowned. Now, this event is something very pivotal, I think, in Myra Hindley's kind of demise. She was described as feeling incredibly guilty, and she actually had a bit of an obsession with Catholicism. As we go through this, you'll actually realise that Myra Hindley's obsession is definitely something that leads down a wrong path. So eventually they did meet. They worked for the same company. Ian Brady was the bookkeep and Myra Hindley was the typist. Now, Myra Hindley was described as being very upset with Ian Brady, this kind of obsessive personality that she has, and she was described in her entries. I have some kind of lines that I picked out. I wonder if Ian is courting. I still feel the same. I haven't spoken to him yet, and I hope he loves me and will marry me. She would frequently drive round near his house hoping that he would spot her, and she even dyed her hair bleach bright blonde like Marilyn Monroe, so hopefully Ian Brady could notice her. Ian Brady was described at work as having these violent outbursts over little things like not winning a racehorse. But Myra Hindley didn't really see this as a deterrent. She quite liked this and was even more drawn to him. So eventually she was noticed by Ian Brady when she sat next to him at work during lunch, and she had William's Wordsworth book with her. He was described as being very sexually deviant, is maybe the word. He was quite sexually violent in the bed, leave her covered in bruises and strangulation. He would make her strip naked, and they have photographs taken of her and videos, and it was all very strange. Ian Brady began to, I don't want to use the word groom Myra Hindley, because even though in some cases he could have groomed her, she was very complicit and even the one that was calling the shots for some of the murders. Some of the murders, but to some extent it could be seen as grooming. He would groom her, and they would talk about robbing a bank. He would try and get her to see how much she would agree to the things he would say about robbing banks, and also they would have long discussions about his favourite books, which was like Mein Kampf. He would frequently make her read it and make her listen to speeches. One of the first dates that they actually went on, they went to cinemas where they watched the trials of the Holocaust that were taking place, so the war criminals, those trials. He took her to go and watch that on one of their first dates. He was definitely seeing how much she would take, or how complicit she would be, or how much she could be manipulated. And it was clear that she could be manipulated 100% the whole way, whatever he wanted. She seemed very obsessed. The first victim was a girl called Pauline Reed. Now, she wasn't actually the first victim they saw. Ian Brady would drive in his motorcycle behind the car that Myra Hindley would be in. They drive along together down the roads in Manchester and in Gorton, and when Ian Brady would see a girl or a boy that he liked the look of, someone that he wanted to take as his victim, he would flash his lights, alerting Myra Hindley to know. She would stop and would try and talk to the victim, try to coax them into the car, because in the 1960s it wasn't heard of women being murderers or luring people to their death. So women were easily trusted, whereas men weren't so much as. So the first victim they saw was a little girl who Myra Hindley knew very well. I think it was her next door neighbour's daughter, or it was her mother's friend's daughter. Either way, it was someone that she knew very well, and so when Ian Brady flashed his lights, she didn't actually stop. She stopped later on after the little girl had gone, and Ian Brady was furious over this. He left the motorcycle and demanded to know why she hadn't stopped, and she then began to say that she couldn't, that she knew her very well, and so they tried again. And this is when they came across Pauline Reed. Pauline Reed was on her way to a dance. She was only 16 years old. And Myra Hindley parked up next to her. She was actually her younger sister's friend, and she said to Pauline Reed, can you help me find a very expensive glove that I have on the Moors, and then afterwards I will take you to the party. Pauline Reed agreed. She was more than happy to help. They went up to the Moors with Ian Brady following behind, and when they got up to the Moors, Ian Brady said, let's go further on into the Moors to look for this glove. When they did, Myra Hindley was described as still waiting in the van. Ian Brady and Pauline Reed walked further into the Moors, and about 30 minutes went by where Myra Hindley was just sat in the car. Now, although she said it was never actually stated what was going to take place to Pauline Reed, She knew that she was going to be sexually assaulted before being murdered. After 30 minutes, Ian Brady called Myra Hindley out of the car to walk towards, and they saw Pauline Reed. Her throat was sliced twice, and in the bigger wound, her coat was being described as stuffed inside it. It's sickening. I can't comprehend or explain the actions that they did. They then buried her on Saddleworth Moor, and they then went home and carried on as normal. The second victim was someone called John Kilbridge. John Kilbridge was picked up at Ashton Town Market in November 1963. He used to work there to try and earn some extra cash, and it's just outside Manchester, so it's really easy to access, about 30 minutes from Gorton on not a busy day. She asked if she could help put some boxes into the car, and if they do, they would give him a bottle of sherry. John Kilbridge did as he was told, and then when he got into the car, they told him that the sherry was actually at their home, not with them. He actually drove them to Saddleworth Moor, where he was sexually assaulted, strangled, and was buried up there. The first victim was Keith Bennett, and he was kidnapped from central Manchester near Victoria Station. It's actually where the AMC cinemas is, just outside there with the big clock. I don't know if anyone's from Manchester, but that's where he was kidnapped, just outside. He was on his way to his grandmother's house and never actually made it. Now, this case, even though all of them are absolutely horrendous, this is really sad in the sense that his body has still not been found till this day. Again, he was coaxed into the car of Myra Hindley. They drove him up to Saddleworth Moor, and they also sexually assaulted. He was also sexually assaulted, and was also strangled and buried up there. But still, this wasn't enough. This is when Myra Hindley and Ian Brady came into contact with Patricia Ann Hopkins. So Patricia visited them quite often, several times a week. She only lived 2 doors down, and she was 11 years old. They would frequently drink wine together. They would go out on the moors together and drive around and just overall have a good time. Now, try to bear in mind, this is a really weird dynamic. Even though it's in the 1960s and leniency on children drinking alcohol wouldn't have been as strict as it is today. If you can imagine, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady are in their early 20s, and Patricia is only 11 years old, and she was spending many nights with them, sometimes 5 times a night. She would stay at the house till maybe 12 or 1:30 in the morning. So this is very strange, to say the least. Her parents knew where she was and that she was in contact with Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, and so she was taken home most nights by the couple, and nothing was ever thought of. She was asked, weirdly, to read out articles of John Kilbridge and Keith Bennett that went missing, and they actually recorded her voice without her knowing, which is very strange. Now, I don't think we'll ever find out why she wasn't killed, because she's still alive. There's quite a lot of speculation why she wasn't. Some speculate that Ian Brady was bored of the way he was killing, wanted to try something new, so he wanted to actually, rather than just kidnap the individuals unknowingly and sexually assault them and bury them, he wanted to actually get to know them. But in getting to know them, they became at risk because people saw Myra Hindley and Ian Brady with Patricia quite a lot of the time. Now, Patricia was described as being very poor, so she probably felt really happy to be in the company of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who had a TV at the time, which they did not. And also, I think she was one of 6 siblings, so she wouldn't have got as much attention as she probably wanted. And so by being with Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, this allowed her to gain access to that. As a serial killer, the urge to kill would have been very strong for Ian Brady, and so on Boxing Day then began to seek out their second victim, Leslie Ann Downing. Now, as I've reiterated, all of them are really awful, but this one is particularly hard to talk about mainly because of what they did. This one, while was the same in the sense that she was sexually assaulted and was buried out in the moors, she was actually taken back to their house first. So Leslie Ann Downing was lured in the same way that the other children were. They dropped their boxes near Leslie Ann Downing and asked her, "Can you help me carry them to my car?" and then took her back to their house. They actually recorded her crying and begging to be let go back to her family, but she wasn't. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were so arrogant. They not only recorded her begging for her life, they asked her to state her name for the radio on the recorder, and it was actually how the police found out who the girl was on The Voice by this. I read some of this transcript. I wouldn't recommend doing so. It's very, very disturbing. She's saying, "Oh, please God, please no, I'm not going to tell anyone. Please let me go." And Myra Hindley is heard saying, "Shut up, you. Shut up, you." And was killed in Saddleworth Moor. They actually made her they actually stripped her of her clothes. Now usually Ian Brady would do this, but would burn the clothes to prevent evidence, because he was described as a very intellectual individual, and even though DNA evidence wasn't great or as great as it is now in the 1960s, he still took the precaution to make sure that all the clothes were burnt, but not in the case for Leslie Ann Downing. What they did was they had her stripped of her clothes, but they put her clothes by her feet. This was not to benefit them, but only to humiliate her. And then we come to their last victim. The last victim was someone called Edward Evans, and this happened October 6, 1965. So Edward Evans had a really nice night out in Manchester, and he was on his way home. He was a teenager, and he got picked up by Myra Hindley. It's not clear how he got back to the house, but you can assume some wine might have been offered. He would have went back home willingly to the house. The women, like I said, in the 1960s weren't really considered to be at risk of being serial killers. They got David, who was the brother-in-law of Myra Hindley, so Myra Hindley's younger sister's husband. Now, David Smith, they got him over. Now, he was 17 at the time, and he was also known as quite the criminal. He was known to drink, but would quite often have quite a lot of fights in pubs and bars in Manchester. His child that he had with Maureen, who was Myra Hindley's younger sister, had died at 6 months of age, and this really grieved David Smith to the point where he was becoming a raging alcoholic. He was drinking all the time, he was fighting constantly, and he was in great depression. Ian Brady loved this. He really revelled in the fact that David Smith was grieving and took advantage of that. He started off first grooming him the same way he groomed Myra Hindley. He would talk about bank robberies that they should do together. He would make him write reports on reading Mein Kampf to make sure he properly understood it. He would make him listen to really racist and anti-Semitic speeches. And while David Smith thought this was very odd and unnatural, he didn't really take much notice of it. He just thought he was someone who was a very close-minded individual. What had happened previously, before the murder of Edward Evans, the teenager who they picked up after a night out in Manchester, David Smith went round to Myra Hindley and Ian Brady's house for a couple of drinks, and Ian Brady actually came up behind David Smith with a gun and popped it behind his head and said, "This is how easy it is to kill a man," and pulled the trigger. Fortunately, there were no bullets in the chamber, and so it was just seen as a really odd joke. But it did actually worry David Smith to the point where he wrote down in a journal later that night that he felt kind of an impending death looming his way. And while he was right, David Smith actually thought it was his own death, but it wasn't. It was going to be the death of Edward Evans. Anyway, the night had come where Edward Evans was over after drinking on a night out. He didn't know Myra Hindley or Ian Brady, and we're not sure how he was brought to their house, but he ended up at the house drinking. Myra Hindley then went and got David Smith and asked him if he could walk her home, that it was dark outside, and they went to the house. When they got there, he was offered a drink and he graciously said yes and went into their house and had a drink. Myra Hindley and David Smith were in the kitchen, and Edward Evans and Ian Brady were in the living room. While Myra Hindley and David Smith were in the kitchen, David Smith heard a piercing scream, a really high-pitched one. He didn't know what was going on, and Myra Hindley was heard to say to David Smith, "Help him, David." David Smith then ran into the living room and saw Ian Brady having an axe and slamming it into the back of Edward Evans' head repeatedly. This would have certainly have killed Edward Evans. The results of his injuries would have killed him, but it wouldn't have something that would have been immediate. What the actual cause of death was for Edward Evans was strangulation with a string. For this to have happened, Edward Evans would have been repeatedly struck in the back of the head with an axe, and then Ian Brady would have strangled Edward Evans to death afterwards when he would have still alive or trying to fight for his life. Now, David Smith witnessed this and was terrified. He did exactly as Myra Hindley and Ian Brady said, took the body upstairs and hid it in the second room. Now, while going back a little bit, while Ian Brady was killing Edward Evans, Myra Hindley's grandmother was only sleeping upstairs. She heard the noise and shouted down to Myra Hindley, like, "What's this noise? What's going on?" Myra Hindley shouted up, "I've just dropped something, but it's okay." And the grandmother went straight back to bed. Somehow, David managed to get out of the house afterwards, after promising to come back the next day to help dispose of the body on Saddleworth Moor. But he ran home, told his wife Maureen what happened, and they went to a public phone box and phoned the police. Now, when the police came, they actually found the body, but they didn't actually believe what David Smith had said. Ian Brady had said that they got into a fight and he ended up killing him, and they believed that over David, who said no, there was no fight. Ian Brady had repeatedly whacked him in the back of the head. It was only with the help of David Smith that they were convicted and found to have killed many more people than just Edward Evans. David Smith had said something about a case being held in storage. The couple they eventually found it in storage and found tons of evidence, pictures, recordings, and this is when they came across Leslie Ann Downing's recording there. But they had no idea at this time of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett's death. After 14 days of trial and 2 hours deliberation, they were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison on the 6th of May 1966. Then in the 1980s, Myra Hindley had this epiphany. She was a changed woman. She was into religion and Catholicism again. She was reading Bibles every day. She was helping other people. She was claiming to be a changed woman and was also claiming to be an actual victim of Ian Brady, and was said to have been terrified of him. Now, this has always been disputed by the fact of the recording of Leslie Ann Downing, where Myra Hindley can be heard being very complicit and telling Leslie Ann Downing to shut up while Ian Brady was sexually assaulting her. No, she wasn't as innocent as she was claiming to be, but she was claiming that she had changed and that she wanted to be paroled. This didn't sit well with Ian Brady when he found out, and so he hinted to more murders of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. Eventually, Keith Bennett's mother, Winnie, wrote to Myra Hindley and basically said, from one woman to another, "Please help me find my son." She tried, and they did actually find Pauline Reed's body. It was not that far from Leslie Ann Downing's body, but they still have yet to find Keith Bennett's body. Ian Brady has said there are more victims. Apparently he wrote to a journalist and said that there's 5 others that they will never know of. But Ian Brady was someone who liked to play a lot of tricks. He would pretend to help police and then go back on his word. He's also on a hunger strike for the last years of his life. There is also some reports of someone called Tommy Rattigan. I think that's how we pronounce it. He was someone who escaped Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, where he was offered jam sandwiches, felt really uneasy in the house, and so made a run for it. I hope you really liked my discussion today about it. Myra Hindley did die in 2002, and Ian Brady died last year in 2017. This story is really, really tragic, and one that haunts Manchester, and I think will forever haunt Manchester for the rest of its days. But we can only hope that Keith Bennett's body is found eventually on the Saddleworth Moors, and that everyone finds peace from this. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, rate, subscribe, give me some advice on what I'm doing right and wrong, and I will see you next week for another mystery murder case. And this one's going to be a really good one. It's also going to be a bit more prepared than the one I've done today. It's the first one. I'm trying to try that out, see how it goes. So yes, I shall see you guys next time.